Okay, fantastic. As I mentioned before, welcome everyone. I am Dr. Nika White, and this is Intentional Conversations Virtual Community Chat. So we do this every week to hold space for communities just to come together to learn with and from each other. I have a tremendous guest today that I'm so excited to introduce. I do want to share that we're using a new and different platform. We have had some challenges in the past, and so for those of you who are used to participating in our events, I just want you to know that we're going to continue to test out a few different options before we probably settle on one main platform. But today we're using Hopin, and hopefully we'll have a good experience. So Nika White Consulting is a management consulting firm that intersects the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion with leadership in business. So we work with all types of clients, private, public sector, different industries and sizes, helping them to integrate into their business framework, strategic diversity, intentional inclusion, and a lens of equity. And so what we do every Friday is bring in a guest co-host, and we have conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, leadership in business. And today, my special co-host is Lily Zheng, and I want to give her a formal introduction. Lily is a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant and executive coach. She works with organizations around the world to create high impact and sustainable change. With her clients, she leverages organizational design, strategy, and culture to find novel solutions to systemic inequalities. She's a dedicated change maker and advocate, and recently named a Forbes DE&I Trailblazer. Lily writes for publications, including Harvard Business Review, Sports at Work, and HR Executive, and she is the co-author of 2 books. I want to give Lily a chance now to greet this audience in her own way. Welcome, Lily.
Hey, folks. It's so great to be here. I'm thrilled to be getting the chance to chat with Dr. Nika White. This is really, really exciting. We were actually both named in the same article on Forbes, and that's sort of how we met, and things just sort of went from there. So I'm thrilled to be talking here today. The conversation is going to be incredible, intense, really fun, and yeah, I'm just looking forward to kicking it off and getting to chat.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Lily, for accepting my invite. I have enjoyed following your work since I became acquainted to you and all that you do. And the only regret that I have is that I didn't know you prior to you and I both being in the Forbes article. The work that you do is so important. I love the fact that you are bold with your work. I think we need courageous leadership in this space. And I have really enjoyed learning from you and look forward to doing so today. So I have shared your bio, which is something that's customary for me as I bring on guest co-hosts. But I always like to follow that up with the simple question of, tell us your story, things that we would not find in your bio.
Ooh, that's a good question. Okay, so I got my start, not as a consultant, but as a student activist back in college. I was... Let's see, there was so much going on back then. We were organizing for a whole bunch of issues. That was around the first time that Black Lives Matter was in the news. Not the second time, more recently, the first time. And as an organizer, I think I was learning a lot about how it was that you could change societies, change institutions. And so we were working really hard to push Stanford University, where I attended college, to become less shitty, less racist, less sexist, less problematic. And that's really where I got my start as an organizer. I think my experiences there really informed my life path. I ended up getting arrested during an action that none of us really planned super well for. And that moment really sort of set in motion my path to try to really understand how it was we could make change, how it was to do this work effectively, and all the different ways in which we could affect institutions, including protest, but not limited to that. And so that took me to really change what I was studying to really focus on organizations and systemic change. That's where my focus on systemic change today comes from. And I ended up going into consulting a few years later and have been there ever since. And so, that's I think where I come from. I try to take the same energy that I had as an organizer and put that towards institutions, put that towards systems, recognizing that change is a multifaceted and often years-long approach that takes multiple people on the inside and the outside. So really helping organizations with that strategy is something that I'm passionate about, and also helping change makers inside and outside companies really act effectively to make change is also something that I've been working to do.
Okay, so I also want you to tell us about your books. I know we mentioned in your bio that you've co-authored 2 books.
Sure.
Let us know what those books are, what they're about, and how people can find them. And
Sure.
we're also going to make sure we put it into the chat.
Sure. The first book is Gender Ambiguity in the Workplace, Transgender and Gender Diverse Discrimination. It was adapted from a dissertation that I helped on as the head research assistant, looking into the workplace experiences of trans people in the US. This was before the modern trans discourse that included like talking about non-binary identities, gender fluid identities. I think this research was one of the first things out there that really showed the trans community not as a monolith. And so, I was thrilled to work on that book. That was a lot of fun. The second book, The Ethical Sellout, came out last year. And that book is really about the daily compromises that people make every day, especially people from marginalized communities, to survive. We basically talked to dozens of people about the compromises that they had to make and really challenged the idea that there's one right way to be a person of color, to be a woman, to be a queer person, etc. Just talking about how systems of oppression around us force us to compromise and offer some tips on how to do so while maintaining our integrity. That came out last year. It has since won an IPPY award, which I'm really pleased to share. And honestly, last year feels like 10 years ago, given everything. But yeah, that book came out recently, and I'm very happy about it. Book 3 is in the works, so I can't tell you what it's about yet.
Oh, okay, great. Congratulations. That's so awesome. Okay, so I want to shift a little bit now, and I want to ask you about what are some ways that we can facilitate and support challenging conversations in a powerful and sustainable way. I want to keep this momentum going.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot I want to break down about that question. And the first is, what is a challenging conversation? I think, the DE&I field has for a long time been built on this foundation of, if we talk about problems, we can fix them. And I'm not necessarily convinced that that's the entire picture. And I say this because people have been talking about race for 400 years, and we haven't fixed racial inequality. And so when I get questions like this that say, like, how do we keep the conversation going? I hesitate a little bit, because I think the conversations that we've been having haven't worked. Because in large part, when we talk about race, it's typically people of color who have very, vivid, intense lived experiences with race, talking to white people who have very different experiences with race, and sharing their trauma, sharing their hardship, sharing what's difficult about the world. And white people saying, oh my gosh, I had no idea. That sounds really hard. It sounds like racism is real and it's bad. And don't get me wrong, I think education is very important, but we're not getting anywhere. Right? We're not getting anywhere from the status quo of having people of color share stories about their trauma and having white people nod along and feel bad about it. And so my answer to your question of how can we keep the conversation going is we desperately need to refocus the conversations that we're having about race to be systemic in nature. We need to be naming and targeting systems of oppression, and more specifically, the structures and systems inherent in our companies, in our communities, in our teams, in our families, to dismantle, right? We can't just say race exists and say that it was a good conversation. We need to say, look, race exists, racism exists, and the hiring process, which you designed yesterday, is hurting people of color every day. Fix it. right? And unless we have that second
Right.
part of the conversation, we can talk about race all day and nothing's ever going to change. And you know, the focus here should be on change. We're talking about race because we want to make things better. And that means we need to be focusing on impact. So, you know, that's I think just crucial. We need to be centering our conversation on how to create impact rather than how to acknowledge everyone's feelings around it.
Very well stated, Lily. I appreciate that. And so you and I both are familiar with Kimberly Crenshaw and her work, and she's responsible for coining the term intersectionality. So from your vantage point, what role does intersectionality play to drive the monumental change right now that we need?
That's an interesting question. I think intersectionality has always played a role, but that's an interesting question framing. I think intersectionality is just the reality of our world, right? It's kind of a trendy buzzword in the last couple of years, but you know, just for the audience members who may not be as familiar with it, intersectionality was coined in a very specific context to describe the hardships that in particular Black women faced and to challenge understanding discrimination through only a single lens, right? I believe it was Black workers were being discriminated against, and the argument was that they were discriminated against in terms of gender, but they also were discriminated in terms of race, and people were only thinking about things one at a time. And so the term sort of came about to say, no, we can experience multiple of our identities at the same time, and discrimination is a multifaceted thing. Now, I think that's just a way of understanding the world, right? Like it's less of it has a role to play and more like it's always been there. Intersectionality has always been the reality of everyone's lived experience, but we've never really thought about making change in terms of it, right? We've always thought of single identity work. We've always said, let's help people of color, let's help Asian people, let's help women, let's help disabled people, and all of these in little separate silos. Intersectionality is an approach. Intersectionality requires an acknowledgement that all of this is tied up. All of this requires everything else, right? There is no liberation. So we can't have liberation for some of us without liberation for all of us. That's the sort of assumption that underlies the usage of terms like intersectionality. And so, you know, I think the role that the term can play is bringing all of this disparate work together. Is saying, no, we can't conceptualize, you know, women's liberation separate from racial justice. Those are one and the same, right? Until we understand that women of color, that queer women of color, that queer trans women of color, that queer trans disabled women of color, right, are all in this together, and that all these systems of oppression intersect, we're never going to achieve the equitable world and the just world that we are working for. That's, I think, the core, the sort of natural end of conceptualizing the intersectional role of this work.
I really appreciate that, Lily. And to your point, I do believe that greater intentionality around the cross-pollination of all of these groups that are finding themselves at some point in time oppressed, that gives us greater power to be able to emerge stronger in acknowledgement that greater efforts and action needs to happen to lead to impact that can allow us all to operate in an inclusive society. And so that's why I see intersectionality becoming really important to the evolved conversation. I want to stay in that vein a little bit. And one frustration that I've heard, particularly of late, is that the focus on racial injustice, you know, the triggering effects of Black and African American community members is leaving some communities, I think about like LGBTQ, to feel as though maybe they're being left out of the conversation right now. And I think it is important to make sure that some of those other groups outside of the Black community are continuing to feel supported as we strive towards greater inclusivity. But I also am so empowered by the need to really amplify what is up front and center right now and impacting so many people. And specifically, I am referring to the Black community. So just what is your response to those statements in general?
So many thoughts about that. And I think the first thing here that I want to point out is saying talking about Black people takes away from talking about queer and trans people. That's a scarcity mindset. And that's also the opposite of an intersectional mindset. The whole point about intersectionality is talking about Blackness requires talking about Black queer people, Black trans people, Black disabled people, Black women, Black Muslim people, right? Everyone is included under that. And so we recognize that even though we're focusing on this moment on Blackness, right? Like, it's never just been about Blackness. If we're trying to support all Black people, right, if that's really what we're working to do, then we need to tie in queer liberation, women's rights, reproductive justice, environmental justice. All of these things are racial issues, and all of these things affect the Black community. And there's something in this for everyone, right? I, as an Asian American queer trans woman, benefit immensely if Black queer trans women can experience thriving in our society, right? Like, this is all tied up. And I really push back against this partitioning of all of our identities and communities as if, you know, Black people and queer people are separate groups. Like, that's ridiculous, right? And so, you know, what the focus should be, I think, is we need to make sure that when we're advocating for a community, we're not advocating for only the most privileged people of that community, right? And so we need to avoid saying, okay, we're going to focus on Black people right now, so we're only going to focus on the rich, heterosexual, cisgender Black men, right? That's, I think, the approach to avoid. We need to say, look, if our focus is on Blackness, we need to focus on the most marginalized and tackle intersecting systems of oppression. And then that approach actually includes everyone, right? Like that's an approach that I think every community can get happy with, but it requires really thinking about liberation work as not a zero-sum game, but as something that all of us are building together. And then we can start to see that, like, fighting for one community is actually fighting for all communities, assuming we do it right.
Yes, absolutely. I knew you would have a beautiful response to that from our previous conversations, and I definitely wanted our audience to benefit. So Lily, you also have really strong opinions about corporate DEI and how it should be practiced that leads to outcomes that are sustainable and impact. And so I want you just to talk about, from your experience, what do you perceive that a lot of organizations are doing wrong, or maybe a better way to say it is should reconsider in their strategic approach to be more effective?
Oh my God, Nika, do you have like 10 hours on you?
Just give us the highlights.
Okay. Well, for the audience, this is my day job, right? Helping companies do it right. And so maybe this is book 4, right? Maybe I should start writing this stuff down. Anyways, so we'll get to it. So just a few things organizations are doing wrong strategically. Seeing DE&I as a public relations issue rather than a core business strategy. So as a problem that you throw money at, that you throw communications at, that you release a Black Lives Matter statement and say, okay, now people aren't going to be mad at us. That's one of the core strategic problems that I see companies making, and it's getting them in a lot of trouble because they're releasing these statements that say, as a company, we stand by the Black community, and then you look inside their company and there's no Black leadership, there's no Black representation, there's no Black people in their pipeline, there's no Black people in their vendors, there's no Black people in their suppliers, there's no Black people in their customers, and you're just like, no, you don't. Like, literally anyone who Googles you can tell that you don't care about Black people, so why would you say that, right? And so that's problem number 1 of 2000. Next, let's see, what else do I have? Companies are exploiting people of color and minorities and marginalized folks to do the labor of making the company better without paying them, without setting them up for success. Right. Whether this is hiring a chief diversity officer and paying them much lower than everyone else, not giving them headcount, not giving them budget, and expecting one person to fix the entire company, which I've seen probably 100 companies do at this point. And what they do is they end up burning out their chief diversity officer, and then they say, oh, well, it looks like it's their problem and they weren't a good fit, when it was the company that was sabotaging them from the start. Or it's companies that situate their entire DEI strategy in their employee resource group or affinity group and say, wow, look at all these passionate people of color. If only like you could put your passion towards making the company better, and then saddling them with the equivalent of a second full-time job that they're not being compensated for, that they're not being valued for, that they're not being evaluated by. And it's just a disaster because, again, they are burning people of color out. They're burning minorities out. They're burning the trust of these marginalized communities. And for what, right? To be underfunded and try to make the entire company better. I was just writing about this on LinkedIn the other day, but I get so many requests, Nika, from employee resource groups that say, Lily, we really need to bring you in to fix our company. And I'm like, okay, let's talk. And they're like, we have a budget of $200. And I'm like, are you hearing yourself? Like it's not your fault, right? Who the hell gave you a budget of $200 to fix the company? Like, is this a joke? You know, like that's the snacks budget. Like it's right. Ridiculous. And so again, it's never these ERG's fault. I think there are always passionate people working at this, but companies are just outright exploiting their labor. And that's, you know, one of the core challenges of our modern DEI work, right? So much of it is just these underfunded, underpaid, underrecognized ERGs that are just struggling to make ends meet, right? And have their full-time job. So that's, I could talk about that forever. Another thing is not tying DE&I into companies' like core functioning, their core mission. Like it's always this separate thing. Like it's always this nice to have instead of this need to have. And so this typically happens when DEI is under HR. It's typically this like, oh, employee development. Let's just celebrate Lunar New Year by having Chinese food like once a year. That's diversity, right? And because of that, you see all this flimsy, low impact, high visibility D&I work that never actually influences or impacts the core business units, right? We need to be working on D&I in sales. We need to be working on D&I in product. We need to be working on D&I in leadership. But when we situate it in HR, it just becomes like, let's just keep our employees entertained. And then D&I work by necessity becomes this entertainment. And it never creates impact. Okay. Let me just stop there. Let me just start with those three things, right? But like those are big, and those are big challenges that I think are severely hampering the ability of any industry, of every company to do like legit high impact D&I work.
No, I love it. And I appreciate your level of candor. I think that for those of us who are in this space, we do have strong convictions about this work. And we want those that we're partnering with to also be successful. And so I think bringing forth some of the challenges and the missteps that a lot of organizations are finding themselves encountering is important. So I want to talk about tokenism. And the reason I want to talk about it, Lily, is because normally we all would shun the idea of tokenism. I often say there's an opportunity in it, not that I advocate for it, but there is an opportunity in that if you are positioned and you're the one only lonely, then find ways to change that landscape and bring others along the way. And so knowing that a lot of organizations are finding it fit right now, because of all that's happening in society, to be even more intentional about filling roles and positions with Black, Indigenous, people of color, really trying to build those pipelines. For those that may find themselves as the only lonely, what are some tips for surviving perceived notions of tokenism?
Yeah, this is such a huge problem. And I think, so first of all, I'm going to share a reframing of just being that one person. Rather than being the token, I think one of my colleagues has framed this as being the trailblazer. Right, being the first one there, and I think that's a really powerful idea. I'm happy to share some research on that. There's a great TED Talk on it. But what that means, I think, for me, is that you use your presence as the first to deeply impact systems and culture. That's what I think you need to do, because if you're the first one there, you need to know that there's enormous pressure put on you to conform to everyone else. That's typically, I mean, that's honestly why like leadership teams of mostly white men will hire one minority, because they kind of know, and sometimes they even select for this, that one person of color, that one woman, that one queer person will sort of be forced to blend in. And then they get to have their diversity without actually challenging anything fundamental about their team or their culture. You see this a lot. And we actually explored this a little bit with The Ethical Sellout, my first book, because oftentimes people that are in this token position are forced to heavily compromise, right? They're forced to give up what makes them feel authentic just to survive in a mostly white, cisgender heterosexual men dominated environment. It's really hard. And so the advice that I would give is to really understand what levers you can press and to set precedents to bring in other people like you. So never be happy with your own success there. I think that's the trap, right? If you say, "Oh, I've made it. I've won," like life has been good to me, I'm going to take a defensive mindset and hold on to what I have, that's the end for you, right? Like you're not going to be able to advocate effectively for people of color, for minorities, etc. You need to instead have a mindset of, I made it. How can I leave doors open behind me? How can I lift people up after me? How can I make sure that the obstacles that I went through to attain this position, I can completely knock down and destroy, so it's so much easier for people like me afterwards? And that change is really hard. Like you need to chip away at the culture of toxic teams. You need to change hiring practices. Like all of this work is tough. And I will also say, please don't do it alone. Do not do it alone, right? Like you might feel like the only lonely. There's a whole team of people there. I'm sure some of them are pretty bad and suck. I'm sure some of them are okay, right? And so finding yourself an ally, finding yourself an accomplice in the same level as you that can help you open doors is going to be a godsend. Because the second that you feel like you're the only one who bears the responsibility of taking care of your entire community, you're going to burn yourself out. Like that is a pathway to burnout. I've never known any professional who truly believes that they're the only one who can do it, who's lasted more than a couple years in that role, because it's exhausting, right? And I've been in that position myself. You every single day, you just wear yourself out going like, how, like I have to be strong or else everyone's going to be disappointed. And that pressure just gets to you over time. Like I really wouldn't recommend it for anyone.
Yeah, the burden of carrying that banner is really intense. And I do appreciate the fact that not everybody is wired to be a trailblazer. And so there's something to be said for allowing those individuals to give themselves permission to not feel the weight of that pressure if it's not something that is going to allow them to thrive. And so I just wanted to bring that to the surface. But you're right. I often say that if you are the token, the only lonely, get in there, do what you can to prove yourself, believe in yourself that you are worthy and you deserve that position, and then change the landscape, bring someone else along the way. And so I appreciate you amplifying that, Lily. So you mentioned ally. Yeah. So you mentioned ally and you mentioned accomplice. So let's go there for a moment. So much has been said right now about allyship. So I want to just give you a chance to react to it. I know that you talked often about allyship from an interpersonal perspective versus systemic. And so just share a little bit about that
allyship,
topic.
I think, in our current cultural understanding is, I'm going to be a little blunt about it, is a dressed up way of saying bystander intervention. And what I mean by that is our current understanding of what a good ally is if somebody says a slur, an ally says, that's bad, don't do it. That's it. That's literally our entire understanding of what ally is. If you see something wrong, say, that's bad. Okay, that's fine. That's good. That's like 101 level content. Frankly, I don't care. Like, it's important to speak up against these instances of discrimination when they occur, but let's be real, right? We're not going to have Frank, the ally around 100% of the time to say, wow, every single time a bad thing happens, I'm going to jump in and say, don't do that. Like, what I need is to have the bad things stop happening, right? If the fundamental challenge here is that we have a toxic culture, no amount of one person saying, stop calling Lily, like, I don't know, a bad word, because the culture is the fundamental thing we're trying to fix. And so when we have allies that are very well intentioned, but all they know is interpersonal work, then they're never going to be able to challenge systems because they don't even conceptualize systems. What we need is people who say, okay, maybe I can speak up every single time that Ben opens his mouth and says something sexist. Or maybe the problem is that Ben is just a huge sexist and we need to fix Ben, right? Like maybe we need to work on him because he is the core challenge that's driving all of this trouble, right? So let's get Ben some training. Let's talk to Ben's manager and see if we can put him on a PIP, right? A process improvement plan. Let's see if we can set some meeting norms such that even if Ben is a raging sexist, we constrain his behavior in ways that force him to be respectable, right? During this meeting, all of these are systemic change. And none of these changes require you to say, hey, Ben, don't say that word, right? It's working on a deeper systemic level. And so I think that's one of the biggest challenges with today's modern understanding of allyship, because we never get to that systemic conversation. I want to have allies talking about how can we make better cultures? How can we make better policies? How can we, align all of our leaders with the vision of the company? That's change work, right? That's change making work. And that requires a bigger skill set than if you see something, say something.
Right, absolutely. I love the fact that you use the word bystander, because for me, it just provided this visual of you have to be there at that point in time.
What do you do if you're not
there? I think the difference, if we really dig deep into what allyship is to accomplish, it is about being willing to sacrifice, take risk, take the initiative. Don't just wait for something to occur, but help to prevent something from occurring. And so I do love the way in which you phrase that. So what are you seeing right now, Lily, in terms of some experimentations that are happening within the DEI space to solve for deeper impact?
Experimentation.
Anything comes to mind?
Yeah, so I think we're seeing a greater focus on leaders, which honestly is great news. I've seen in the past a lot of people focused on training HR, right? Because DE&I was seen as an HR issue. And now people are finally coming around to the idea that we can't really solve all these major challenges in our society and in our companies unless we bring leadership on board. And this is reflected in like the clients that I'm getting. Before, I was inundated with one and done workshops, right? Like, Lily, please lead an unconscious bias training for our company so that they can make sure not to say these 10 words and say those 10 words instead. And I'm like, that's the worst idea I've ever heard. Like, how is that going to create systemic change? And now we're saying, okay, Lily, we understand that our companies have real problems. So let's start from the top. Let's train our leadership. Let's design a DE&I strategy. Let's make sure every leader feels empowered to adopt and transform that strategy to fit their own business unit. Let's design metrics. Let's have goals. Let's hold people accountable. It's a fundamental change in the way that this conversation is happening. And maybe I'm a little biased because this is work that I like, but I think it's great. Like, I think this is the work that has needed to happen for the last 50 years. And I'm actually seeing companies start to make some progress on it. I'm not saying that things are perfect or close to perfect, but at least they're thinking about it in the right way. And also, I'm seeing people say, instead of DE&I as a 45-minute affair, it's a 5-year project. And that is, I think, such a good framework, because you need to recognize the goal of this. We are interrupting 400 plus years of oppression in our companies, right? You really want to do that in 45 minutes? You're not. You're just not. And so bare minimum, really redesigning everything in your company is going to take 5 years. And if you're going to think about how your company is going to actually push back against an oppressive world, 10 years, right? This is a long, long, long approach. And I think that's just what the work has to be. And more leaders are coming around to it, which I find really heartening.
I agree. It's been quite refreshing to see a deeper level of innovation and commitment to finding new ways to solve for DEI. So I'm certainly with you on that. So I have been saying lately to a lot of individuals and groups that now is a time where we need to be brave and not perfect. And I just want to get your thoughts about that statement in general. I feel like it's important for leaders to really recognize that it's okay not to have all the answers, but we still need you to lead with that level of courage. And don't be afraid of having to be perfect. We're going to make some missteps, but we still need people to be willing to
Yeah, this
try.
is such a
So what are your
complex
thoughts about
topic
that?
because on the one hand, I I see so many leaders hesitant to say anything because they're worried that if they mess up, they'll be torn down.
Right.
And on the other hand, I also
Mm-hmm.
see a lot of leaders actually making mistakes and getting torn down. And so some part of me is like, like
That's true.
you might be onto something there, but the challenge isn't that. So I think it's a false problem, right? It's not if you mess up, you'll be torn down. What people are responding to is a lack of authenticity, a lack of transparency, and a lack of accountability, right? When all three things are apparent and then you mess up, we're going to tear you down because we perceive that you don't want to change, you don't want to get better, you don't actually care about this, you're just being performative, and then we'll tear you down. So the way to do it right is to say, look, I'm a leader, I'm a white man. This is the first time I've ever thought about this. That's kind of embarrassing. I really wish I had learned this earlier. I didn't. I'm sorry. I'm working on it now. This is really tough. Now, what this means for the company, we are still trying to figure out. We started here. We've done this. We've worked on our hiring. We haven't really understood how to fix these big problems. We realize that we need to understand how to fix these big problems. We're bringing someone in to help. We're engaging our employees to help. We recognize that this is going to be a big journey. This is really tough. We've messed up a bunch. We've lost the trust of some of our employees. We're working on that. We're going to bring it back. It starts with us. We're going to do it right. Here's how you can hold us accountable. These are our goals for the next 6 months, for the next year, for the next 3 years. We've made them public. Please feel free to hold us accountable. We're going to be releasing a report every year detailing our progress on these goals. Thanks so much for your patience with us. Things are really tough. We are learning. We're committed to this better future together. I'm committed to being part of this as a leader. Write that down, broadcast it, right? Like that's a pretty decent statement.
Yes.
Right? And I just made that up.
No, it is.
And so
Yeah.
again, right? Like that's what we need more of from our leaders. We need that radical honesty, we need that transparency, and we need accountability, right? We need people to say, look, if I mess up, I am asking all of you to hold me to it. And when we don't see those things, I don't really have much patience, right? If you're giving me a half-assed apology and then you mess up, I don't really feel bad for you, right? Like maybe you deserve to get torn down a little bit because if I can come up with that statement in 20 seconds live on air, there's no reason why your entire communications and PR team can't come up with something better.
Yeah, I love that. And we are going to make mistakes. And I think it's important how we respond to it. I've been telling people that when you encounter a mistake, somebody brings that to your attention. Maybe it's a blind spot. Perhaps it's something that you just weren't aware of. It still does not exonerate you from the consequences of your actions. So you have to own it. And the best apology is change behavior. So if you decide not to change, then you are choosing whatever that behavior and that attitude, those sentiments were. And I think that's quite telling. So we really can separate the leaders that are serious about this work versus those who are not. So I appreciate you kind of giving us a model, Lily, of what to look for and how we can hold our leaders accountable. So we're going to shift a little bit. I do want to bring in some questions from our audience. So I'm going to ask Anna to kind of get those prepared for us. But I want to go into another quick question before we do that. Women's pay equality. A big conversation happening right now, obviously, because of the year, the month. And just want to get your thoughts about what are you seeing that is being, from a conversation perspective, is being perceived as meaningful to get to greater parity in that regard?
So I'm seeing pay equality,
right?
Pay so equality. Honestly, I'm seeing a lot of talk around let's not make this about white women's pay equality, which I think is great. like super great. I think
Right, sure.
intersectionality, again, we need to focus on, especially given that like pay disparities are so much bigger. They expand, right, for Asian women, for Latinx women, for Indigenous women, for Black women, Black queer women, Black trans women, right? So that's the entire intersectionality conversation. Now, when we talk about parity, I think this is a much larger conversation that frankly we could have an entire podcast conversation on. But I think these days we've moved away in many of our companies from blatant pay discrimination for the exact same task, right? So Bob is a secretary and he earns 60K, and Janet is the exact same secretary and earns 40K. We've seen a little less of that, which is good, but now we're seeing parity really emerge in more subtle ways, in that maybe Janet was never told about the opportunity that's coming up next month, and Bob was. And so while Janet's earning fine in her role, she never learned that there was an opportunity for promotion. Maybe Bob was offered mentorship. Maybe Bob was offered sponsorship. Maybe Bob had more flexibility in his schedule than Janet. Maybe Janet was a mother and she experienced, the motherhood penalty. I think all of these additional, more subtle factors beyond just you're a woman, so I'm going to pay you half as much. That's really the challenge that's facing us to achieve parity going forward. Just talking about gender, right? And I think race and ability and sexuality all intersects with that. And those more subtle systemic challenges are, I think, the next frontier when it comes to going about this work. And I think that's what I talk about when I talk about the equity of DE&I, right? Like, this isn't just about making Janet feel like she's included at work, which is important. This isn't just making sure that you have women at work, which actually a lot of companies are getting better at. We're actually seeing decent representation. But when you actually look at where the women in companies are concentrated, the women are at the bottom, right? Most of them are at the bottom. And that's because we haven't yet had this conversation about equity and parity. Who's getting offered opportunities? Who's getting offered resources? Who's getting set up for success and who isn't? And that's, I think, the next conversation that we need to have.
I agree. Thank you. So I'm looking into the chat and we do have a good bit of engagement going on. And I want to bring to the fore a question that Catherine Hall has. How do we have leaders and clients not serious about the work or come across like they're just trying to check a box? So what do we do about those leaders?
What do we do about them? Okay, so I need to understand who we is. So if we as a customer or a consumer, you go elsewhere and you express that checking boxes isn't going to be enough for you, right? You raise the bar, you say, look, I'm here for a real commitment. I'll come back when I see it. And that's good enough. If you are, I don't know, like let's say I'm a consultant, which I am, and I'm working with these leaders, then my approach would be to really focus on the impact. I'll say, okay, Jerry, maybe he's named Jerry, we can check this box. This is going to be the outcome of that. You're not going to see any improvement there. You're not going to see any improvement here. Nothing's going to change there. People are probably going to be a little happier for about 3 months until they figure out that you didn't actually do anything, and then they'll hate you more. So, knowing that this is the impact, Jerry, would you still like to go forward with this project? And usually the answer is, oh, I didn't think about that. I thought that I could really fix everything by checking the box. And then you say, no, you can't. What would you like to do instead? And then you actually have a real conversation. Because what I find is the business leaders cannot tie D&I into any of the other mandates that they have to run a business. They just don't understand. They don't conceptualize DEI as something that actually makes things better for any part of their business. And so you need to help them do that. You need to say, look, your products, they're garbage. They're made for white people. They're made for men. No one who's not a white man likes them. Do you want to fix that? Do you maybe want to fix that? Because that's probably costing you like millions in revenue every year. It's probably a challenge. Maybe you want to look into that. And when you can make it real to them, you can say, look, we don't fix this problem by checking a box, right? If your company went through a digital transformation, which many have in the last couple of years, especially recently, right, with remote work, then like, did you just tell people to print out a picture of a computer and say, wow, you have a computer now? Like, absolutely not, right? You gave people damn computers. And so in the same way, we need to be taking DEI seriously, and we need to be tying DEI to the outcomes of the organization that we want to see. And so when you can have those conversations just very frankly, very openly, like you don't even have to make a business case. Like don't say like hire 2 more Black people and you'll make 50 more bucks a year, because that's a specious argument. Don't do it. Say your company is hurting a lot right now because you're designing for, I don't know, a very small subset of the world, which is cisgender, heterosexual, rich white men. If you want to expand anywhere past that, you got to do better. Mm-hmm. That's just a fact, right? Like there's not much to say around that. Like that is just a cold, hard fact.
Yeah, and let's face it, Lily, the way that you position it, it sounds so easy.
Not easy.
But it's not always really easy. Yeah, it's not easy. It's a risk for a lot of people who really care about this work and the people in which they're trying to impact in doing this work. And I even think about Jessie Heath. She posted into our chat that she is someone that has influence with senior team and the board. And the work of leading DEI has been pushed to the council to fix the organization. And they're burning out. And so her question is, how can she, in a meaningful ways, really get those leaders to take ownership on this journey?
Okay. So this relates a little bit to what I was saying earlier, and I do apologize if it came off as flippant. It is tough work, right? And I think the framing might be straightforward and simple, but the actual implementation, I mean, that's why I have a day job, right? It's really hard. So now the thing that I would recommend is to help leaders frame it in terms of value created and say, look, so your unit, right, your business unit is currently having major challenges because of DE&I. How much value are you losing? How much value can you stand to create by having an inclusive team, by having an inclusive company, by making better products, by making better services, right? And once we understand that, maybe in terms of even numbers, if you like that, then why is it that you're getting zero budget to do a project that will create 10 times return on investment? That's ridiculous. Like, wouldn't you like to own a project that has 10 times return on investment? And again, like you need to be able to speak that language and say D&I is not a nice to have, it is a need to have. This is the value that's created by it. And when we can have those conversations and move away from this space of well, okay, not move away. It's more code switching. Personally, I think we should do D&I because it's right? We should do D&I because we care about a more just world. Not every leader can parse that. Usually they say, okay, that sounds very wishy-washy, right? I have a company to run. You can't use that language with them, so you need to say something different. You need to say, I don't know, demographics in our country are changing and Gen Z hates you right now. So unless you want to inherit a really big problem in 5 or 10 years when they get some more spending power, we have a real mandate to turn things around. And that's a conversation that I think leaders can totally get around because they're thinking about these sorts of macro problems every day. And so saying, look, why are you having this little council that has no power and no budget, no authority, no headcount own what you should be owning? Because they're ideally creating value for you. Do you want this council to mess things up for you because they have no idea what you're doing and they have no power to implement change across your unit? Probably not. Maybe you should own this. This is probably a big deal. And so that's the approach that I take, just to get leaders to feel like they personally have some buy-in because there's so much value that's in it for them. And I think thinking about it in terms of like really value created and not just, okay, we're being reactive. People on the outside are really angry. So just tell me the 2 things I got to do to shut them up, right? That framing will get you in trouble. And if you work from it, there's no amount of passion that you can put in as a council that will actually make things better.
No, I love that, Lily. And for clarity's sake, no, you didn't come across as flippant at all. I just know that those of us who are directly in this space, sometimes because of that experience, we can come across overly confident, including myself. And I just wanted to find some practical ways to address the questions that are coming forth. And so I appreciate that explanation. And by the way, Jessie, I do apologize. Jessie is a he. I appreciate that. Okay, so I'm seeing another question, and this comes from Toki. And she's saying that some organizations tie their DEI objectives to their leader or manager's performance reviews. And her question for you, Lily, is do you think this is a step in the right direction
absolutely, totally.
for accountability?
Because performance reviews and evaluation should reflect the priorities of the organization, right? Most of them reflect performance, obviously. That's great, but performance in what, right? Performance in how many calls you make probably makes sense for a salesperson. But when we say performance in creating a culture of inclusion, that shows that companies care about creating a culture of inclusion. When we say performance in continuing to diversify your team, your vendors, your suppliers, your pipeline, that shows that companies care about that. What I've most appreciated recently is companies tying the salaries and bonuses of their C-suite to the diversity of the entire company, because that shows to me that they really take this seriously. That goes further than saying, we're committed to a diverse company. Instead, they say, no, we're going to prove that we're committed to a diverse company because we're going to take some personal hits if we don't succeed, right? I think that's definitely a step in the right direction, because it reflects that people are willing to take risk and people are willing to put their money where their mouth is. Like if you have performance evaluations that include DEI metrics, what that means is you can have the highest performing employee ever who has terrible diversity reputation, terrible diversity impact, not be rated well. That's gutsy. That's really good, right? What that means is organizations are willing to turn their back on their highest performers if they don't, shape up in terms of DEI. That's a big commitment, and I really respect that.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. So as I see our time winds down, I want to ask you personally, on a personal level, what actions do you feel called to in this moment?
There's so much. Well, I'm trying to help the nonprofits that I know in my life, helping them with some pro bono consulting, helping them survive, helping them support communities on the ground. I feel like, especially low income, queer, trans, people of color are having a real tough time right now, right? Given COVID, given systemic racism, given police violence, given this administration, just a lot of pressure on people. And so I try to give back that way. In the corporate space, I continue to be drawn to this sort of deep strategic work. I think we are in probably the biggest opportunity that I've seen in the last decade or so to actually impact real sustainable DEI change. And so I'm trying to set up all these organizations for success. So get a good strategy on board, make sure your leadership knows what they're doing, set a framework, a foundation, and a plan for DE&I that you're accountable to, even if all this public pressure disappears, that your company's still held to, right? That's sort of what I care about now. How can I design such that even if next year the current conversation goes away and people stop talking about these issues, that companies are path dependent and bound to this path that they've started on? How can I ensure that outcome? So that's what I'm passionate about right now.
Love it. Love it. Okay, going back to the chat, Noel has a question. If you do not have access to leadership, how do we convince our direct managers or HR to take the red pill and buy in to committing to systemic change, DEI workplace, thus bringing it to the attention of their leaders and CEO? So if your influence is with not the top level leadership,
if you have influence with your direct manager, then that's the answer, right? You just work through them. Because my answer to this question, you've kind of preempted it with a really good question, is usually work with your direct manager to create a model and a prototype for what it could be for the rest of the company, right? So I always say make change on the local level so that you can inspire change on the larger level. Now, I think the one caveat here is if you don't have a great manager, it's going to be really hard. And I'm just going to be real, right? Like not everyone in every team with every manager can just easily make change and convince their manager to take these risks. And so I think if you really care about impacting your company, there are other things you can do besides your direct manager. If your manager isn't receptive, you could join a resource group, though, keep in mind, like all of my caveats that I've said during this conversation. You can also look for a different manager. I hate to say it, like some managers are better suited for creating this sort of change on their teams. And so, most importantly, I'm going to say, like, it's crucial that you take care of yourself, and it's crucial that you invest in your own well-being and thriving and success in that company first and foremost. And I think I'm never going to tell someone to try to advocate to a manager that isn't safe, that doesn't get it, that doesn't want to get it, because I think I'm not telling people to martyr themselves, right, for DNI. But I think the path of creating impact is big, it's long, it involves a lot of people. And so maybe you're not the right person to influence your manager. Maybe you're friends with someone who is. Maybe you're friends with someone who's friends with the CEO. Maybe you know someone who's friends with a director in another part of the organization. There are always ways you can make change using your networks and connections besides just your immediate manager, though I will admit that, like, they are the most effective, closest person to you most of the time. And so just be creative about it. Like, figure out where in the institution, where in the organization you can have most influence, and really draw on that.
Awesome. So as we continue to think about this, the importance of accountability with this work, a question that's come forth, which I think is great, is how do you address the statement that tying incentives to hiring goals can result in people being hired for the wrong reasons?
For the wrong reasons. So yes. Okay. So I'm assuming this refers to something like, look, we're going to give you an incentive to hire more people of color. And so then the worry is like, oh, we're hiring more people of color who aren't qualified for the role. That's the fear, right? Yeah. I think it's a red herring.
Yeah, that's how I'm interpreting it as well.
Question, but I think the intention behind it is, how can we ensure that we are hiring for the best, right? And how do we integrate a DE&I focus into continuing to hire for the best? That's how I'm going to reframe this question. So how I would answer that is, don't have incentives for hiring goals. Have new hiring criteria that can only really be achieved by a diverse population. And let me explain this. What if you had a hiring criteria where all candidates, A, need to be able to create and contribute to an inclusive culture, B, need to be able to interact with a variety of clients and colleagues spanning race, gender, sexuality, etc., right? C, need to have a rich background that gives them insight into some of our target populations and communities that we work with. Those are hard and fast criteria, right? Those are legit. And I'm gonna be real with you, you're gonna be hiring much more people of color than white people who meet those criteria. But again, because you've set very clear criteria, you are going to be hiring for the best in those roles who meet those criteria. And if it turns out that most of them are people of color, that's great. That's much stronger and much more robust than saying, bring in 3 Black people by the end of the month, right? Because I can totally see a hiring manager going to a hiring site and going like, oh, you, right, done, taken care of. But when you have criteria like this, you really make it apparent that diversity isn't just a checkbox. It's something that you value for strategic reasons. And so I highly recommend that you take this approach.
Absolutely. I love that. Well, I always hate this time. We're at the top of the hour. Lily, you have been great. I do want to give you the final words. I want to thank this audience, though, for being here with us today. I hope that you have found the conversations enlightening and useful to your own personal journey of leading inclusively. And I always like to end with the question for our co-host of, what have I not asked you about?
Oh my gosh.
That you wish to share?
There's so much to talk about. I think the last thing that I want to share is that this is long work.
I know.
And this is work that takes community. And so never feel like, as someone who's passionate about DEI, that you are alone. There are so many people out in the world doing this work. Myself, Nika, so many other practitioners, experts, advocates. When you feel like the world is bleak, as it sometimes is and has been in the last couple of months, just remind yourself that there are so many people out here doing this every day, and that you have permission from all of us to take a break and to take care of yourself, because we need to be doing this into the long term. We need to be sustaining this work, and that requires us to sustain ourselves. So just, take care of yourself, stay hydrated, rest when you can, And we're in this together. We're gonna do it, and we're gonna win.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lily. I feel so seen, valued, and heard that you accepted my invite. And it was so great to visit with you today with this community. I do want to remind each of you that we're going to be taking a break next week. This is part of self-care, but it's also the Labor Day holiday weekend. So we won't be here next Friday, but we will return on September the 11th with my special guest co-host, Tim Pecoraro. So I look forward to having you all join us then. Have a great weekend. Take care. Bye-bye.